Thank you, Professor Kumkum Roy, and a warm welcome to all of you. And I'd like to say I'm happy I'm here because I hope to listen to many of you rather than say anything much myself. I do have a little time this afternoon, fortunately. So I thought it would be nice to come and listen, as she said, to the experiences of people and to at least two papers. Now, this is a very important subject, and I'm very glad that the Women's Studies program has decided to take this up and to open up a discussion, and a university like ours is the correct place to do it. And as we all know, many students have already been involved in many of the protests which were being held. The unfortunate incident which happened in December 2012, of course, has become extremely important, and since then the debate about sexual violence has become even more significant, even more important, and is being talked about everywhere. Because this seems to be a very important incident. It's true that sexual harassment takes place almost on a daily basis, everywhere, in all parts of the country. You don't have to go looking for it. But this incident has been important because it has opened up a whole debate about what should be done and how should such incidents be addressed, what is wrong, what is the way ahead, and so on. And I think it's extremely important also because there have been protests by young people and by citizens, by a younger group of people who feel that this is something that should not be allowed. And it's also happened on a very unprecedented scale. The very large amount of protests that were held and the number of people who participated in it and so on. It also shows that women are no longer prepared to keep silent as in the past. It's not as if such things have not been happening over the years, but it also shows that today young women are not prepared to remain silent. And also society as a whole, large sections of it is not prepared to remain silent also. It has of course made the government think to sit up and take some action, although what that kind of action is, we have yet to analyze and see. The government has done things like fast-track courts, also the ordinance which was referred to. I don't know whether the ordinance was a mere knee-jerk reaction or whether it really is going to be worthwhile, and what is going to come after that. Is it the beginning of something, or is it going to stop there? These are things that do need to be looked at. In fact, the whole issue has become so important that the President in his speech referred to it. I'm sure many of you must have heard it. He said that you need to, I think he said, resetting the moral compass of the nation. Meaning that, we all need to rethink about relationships, human relationships in general, how people behave in society. So things have reached a stage where they seem to be taken far more seriously than in the past. And let's hope they will continue to be taken seriously and it will not just be a one-time thing, and which is why discussions like this are extremely important to take the issue further as such. But there's a lot that needs to be done. I'm not an expert in the subject and there are many present here, but my feeling is that there are a lot of laws and rules which already exist. And the way I see it is the problem is implementation. For example, the whole issue of policing. I know that people who have written police reform reports, extensive reports about how reform within the policing system as a whole should take place. How policemen, the average constable, spends something like 12 to 15 hours in duty, the conditions under which they live, what they are paid, the kind of treatment they are given, the kind of training they get. And of course there are Delhi-specific problems, like most of them are working with VVIPs, and there are very few policemen per citizen and so on. I think there are enormous number of reports already available. One of them, I think, written in this university itself by Professor Mathur, on how the government should reform policing. And policing is a very complex subject in itself, and I think that is something also that somebody should take up in a big way. Because that could bring a great deal of difference, and of course now the government has decided that there are going to be more women constables and so on. So I think that's one extremely important aspect that at some point needs to be looked at. The second is, of course, how the lower judiciary particularly views women, how the fast-track courts function, how rape trials are held. I'm sure Pratiksha will have a lot, as in the past I've heard her on this. In what terrible conditions they are held, and the way questions are asked, and the way tests are done. So the lower judiciary, in fact, needs to be sensitized a great deal. It's not so much the higher judiciary. The cases go largely to magistrates, and not many of them are women sometimes. And then there was this whole debate about whether it should be held in camera or not. So there is the whole question of what happens when the case reaches the judiciary, once it's actually registered, if at all, in a police station. So there is the whole question of the judiciary and how rape trials should be held. All of these are important questions, but ultimately the question is also, how do you finally bring about a change in attitude to women? This is a subject on which one could keep on debating and talking about, but it is ultimately, it lies at the heart of the whole thing. I mean, how does society see women, and what is the attitude to them, whether they are walking on the street or sitting in a university or holding any position of power. Even then I can tell you that there are differences in the way women are observed, seen, commented upon, and so on. So how do you change attitudes to women? I mean, I think this is a very fundamental subject, and this also at some point in all this does need to be looked at as such. All of this does have implications for our university. It's true that we are lucky that we live in a place where, well, we are relatively much better off. Much better off. But still, I think these are issues that do need to be looked into and have implications for the university, for our own private and public lives. And also finally, as was said in, I think, your concept note, how protests should be held, when they should be held, where they should be held, what are the issues one should protest about. So I think there's a whole gamut of very complex issues that all of you have before you today. Some of them, I believe, were looked at in an earlier round, but I'm sure today's round will also throw some light on them. And I look forward to listening to all of you, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much. We now start the first session with Pratiksha speaking first, about 20 minutes per speaker. And please switch off your cell phones or make them silent. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here today. We are really at a moment of crisis today, and it is until the 21st of this month we won't really know what is the fate of this protest. So it's hard to predict what the outcome of the December protest is going to be. JNU has taken the lead in engaging with the process of judicial reform, which deserves both applause and reflection. And the continuing protest against the law's madness, there's no other way one can characterize the Criminal Law Ordinance 2013, has been productive of a transformative politics. And I think the agenda today is to talk about how this transformative politics may alter the sexism that inhabits the academia, if I'm not mistaken. So I won't go into the problems with the ordinance very much, but I can come back to it in the discussion. The ordinance, which makes sexual assault gender neutral, is not based on a critique of gender-based discrimination. It retains discrimination by not recommending the deletion of section 377, retaining the marital rape exemption, criminalizing love, and criminalizing all sex work as trafficking. In other words, instead of formulating a law against sexual assault, which protects the bodily integrity of all women, it reasserts and expands the use of patriarchal morality to regulate sexuality, and it will better sexual violence prosecutions. The use of laws and policies against sexual violence to regulate transgressive sexuality should really worry us. When love is characterized as rape and rape is disguised as love, by laws and policies, violence is normalized and sexual agency denied. In JNU, a wider debate on sexuality must mark this moment of transformative politics. A sustained and systemic effort must be made to bring sexuality per se out of the closet. We need to critique all forms of homophobia, which unfortunately are deeply entrenched in JNU, to transform what it means really to live in Bekhof Azadi. Further, specific guidelines and information must be developed to redress domestic violence between intimate partners. JNU needs to create a task force to identify the areas of intervention, putting in place an emergency response system, make information of counselors, lawyers, support groups, official available, hand out information about how to file a complaint, where and which format. There is no substitute for prevention. Hence, JNU must also initiate critical legal literacy programs across schools and centers. Now, how may we think of dissent or critique, which critique, which translates into protest outside JNU? How does this translate into our classroom, right? So, what is the place of the critique of sexual violence, for example, and the syllabi of the courses taught in JNU? I had some conversations with some students, and most of them said that we don't really read much around sexual violence, and there is a lot of research that one can refer, I mean, very good writing one can read. So why is it not part of our syllabus? Ved Kumari, when she writes about law schools and how difficult it was to teach section 357 or 376, she describes teaching the rape law in law schools as a cultural and political process, since talking about rape is constructed as indecent and embarrassing. Further research on sexual violence remains marginal to most disciplines, and perhaps WSP could take a lead in compiling for us how much research has JNU produced on sexual violence since its inception, right? And or how many courses teach writings, the critique of sexual violence. So JNU must take seriously the absence of sufficient serious research and initiate research programs with adequate funding for students and faculty to redress this lag. We not only need to understand how the university is experienced as a gender space, but also how do people define sexual violence. Also, JNU must conduct a survey among students, employees and faculties on sexual harassment and sexual violence generally. This also means auditing of spaces on campus where women students have experienced sexual harassment, more lighting on streets, regulation of traffic, safer landscaping. All the demands that we have put forward in relation to the city should also apply to JNU. One of my students, a couple of months, came to class very upset because a man stopped on the road and flashed at her, and the security wasn't very responsive. So we should not assume that as a space JNU is completely immune to what happens outside. Most importantly, we need swift and deterrent action against any case of sexual harassment by a faculty member of the university. This means a determined stance not to tolerate, protect, or make excuses for any teacher who sexually harasses a student. The mechanisms for complaint and redress, now tested and tried, follow due process. However, delay subverts such process, working against the vulnerable student who finds courage to fight for dignity. And any university must be totally committed to making extinct such forms of sexual harassment. Now, the crisis that afflicts most universities today is the difficulty in recalling a once cherished value. And what was this value? What was meant by the autonomy of the university. This politics of forgetting is pertinent to flag today, since our universities today are being transformed into sanitized spaces where dissent is controlled, disciplined and put under surveillance. In the early days of the December protest, my friends from University of Delhi narrated to me how permission was denied to them to hold a late night march against what had happened, on the grounds that women protesters will be molested at night, ironically enough. Although protests were successfully organized in DU, a systemic problem remains. Women in hostels have to take permissions, and sometimes they even have to take roll call at the site of the protest after the hostel gates are closed. Many women students face sexual harassment during protests. I remember how a battery of police in riot gear marched with 40 women students in DU who were demanding the implementation of the sexual harassment policy almost a decade ago. Not only did they exceed us in number, but they also sexually harassed us and passed many different kinds of lewd comments. Worse stories were heard from students and faculty at the recent protest at SRCC recently. A petition to the Lieutenant Governor of Delhi describes the following scenes, and I quote, "To the shock and at the SRCC protest, to the shock and horror of onlookers, many female students and several female teachers were molested, manhandled and abused with the crudest sexual language and gestures by the same police personnel. Words like Kutya and Randi were often amongst the mildest of the language used. Further, besides performing highly sexually offensive gestures like kissing, whistling and lewd hand signals, many of the police present openly groped and molested the female students, threatened them with sexual violence in addition to beating them." And you know what, that they were also told that they would be sexually penetrated with irons and iron rods and lathis as had been done in Gujarat. And even so, when these students and faculty lodge FIRs at the Maurits Nagar Thana, there are counter FIRs which have been lodged against one DU teacher and 8 students. I think 5 of them belong to JNU, under the sections of rioting, unlawful assembly, obstruction of public servant, causing hurt to public servant, etc. And 2 of these cases are non-bailable. The women students who had been sexually abused and molested have hesitated to lodge complaints of sexual harassment for being similarly charged or being harassed by the ABVP or the police. Now, the fear of counter cases and violent harassment we must recognize as a deterrent to filing criminal complaints against sexual harassment, and which is what this ordinance will make it possible for men to file sexual assault cases against women, right? So it sort of works into this culture of filing counter complaints. A working group of teachers and students must be formed across universities to write and inquire into the role of police in the universities. Perhaps JNU could take a lead in this. Surely the complaints of sexual harassment, and some of these are our students, should move JNU to inquire into these complaints of sexual harassment, and also demand that the Apex Committee on Sexual Harassment in Delhi University should set up an inquiry into what happened during these protests. Further, JNU must minimally demand that the sexual harassment policy be activated, especially in circumstances where sexual harassment is reported during protests. This is critical since sexual violence and its threat is used as a tactic to control and quash dissent. Not to activate the sexual harassment policy to such situations is tantamount to tolerating rape culture. Thank you.
Thank you. One of the dangers of asking me to speak is either I can go on and on and on and get more excited at least while I speak, or I really have nothing to say. So as usual, going second has the advantage that Pratiksha said everything that I wanted to say, but I thought that we should I thought I would like to share with the community our experience of testifying before the Verma Committee, but also to use that as a springboard for us to really question whether I actually went and spoke the truths there. Because, and so my reference here is going to be particularly the GS Cash, which, as many of you know, we started, JNU was the first institution to implement the Vishaka Committee, and so I want to talk a little bit about that movement, and then the testimony that I gave before GS Cash, which I believe is true, but clearly there is something that we need to ask whether it is adequate and what should we do now in terms of looking at sexual harassment. And so anyway, just to fill in those people who haven't heard me talk about this before, is that the movement for GS Cash was, it is perhaps the only such institution in the world where you have a university committee which is comprises of popularly elected members from various sections of the university community. And this movement started in '97. Again, there was a bunch of small teachers and students who together decided that they wanted to, the Vishaka judgment did not even come yet. And
The next 2-3 years saw an incredibly vibrant mobilization as in Delhi University, where I think for many of us, people who have been in the students' movement, recognized that this institution was going to address something that was disappeared even in a progressive place like JNU. That is, if sexual harassment is an interpersonal exercise of power, while JNU has been always very safe and very secure, but this was something that was elided from public discussion, or it became a site of immense polarized mobilization, where the woman complainant usually felt beset by the expectations that were imposed on her by a public mobilization. So just so that you all have a sense of what JNU was like in that period, sexual harassers would be caught. Usually they were outsiders, those are the ones who would be caught. So, and a car was burnt to protect our women. In another instance, and these are all, left groups who were involved at least in these protests. In another case, the person who was caught had his face blackened and he was paraded around the hospitals. Now, knowing, as we know now, that that kind of culture is extremely dangerous for the security of women, so many people felt that we had to push for this committee. But in the process of that, many other things were left. That when you seek to, make appear something which is disappeared, you're going to always face a tremendous wall that will require it to be hidden forever. So not just having the committee was not enough. We said that the committee, we all felt rather, that the committee would be our protection against the forces of patriarchy that want to take women's experience of discrimination and use it as a tool to discriminate against women, to protect them, to make them secure. But we also needed to be able to make that tool work. We needed to formulate a set of rules because we were taking a leap out into the unknown. And that leap required us to be more and more democratic. Because when my own experiences disappeared, but if the experience of a Karamchari woman or the experience of a student is going to be even more disappeared in this framework. So the idea of a very important part of the component of the movement for GS Cash, and it carried on for about 3 years, that we set about formulating the rules and to make a completely different attempt at trying to provide justice. Underlying that notion of justice was the idea that sexual harassment is something that needs to be redressed. It's not something that needs to be complained about. So one of the things that I would like us to consider is that while we have developed a mechanism for complaint, have we developed a mechanism for redressal? And I think that the record has been patchy, because I would like to tell all of you here that to date, any woman who has complained against a hierarchical superior, usually a faculty member, has not, if she's been a student, has never completed her course. She has left JNU, so that even in our wonderful university today, clearly we've not, I would say, not done redressal. So if if she's left JNU, the person might have been complained, that she complained against might have been acted upon. So I don't think that we have a great evidence. But also what we didn't do at this time, and I think that is essential that we begin to do now, that it struck me when I appeared before the Justice Verma Commission that everybody treats JNU as special. And that's what Gopal Subramaniam repeatedly said, JNU is special, teachers are very nice there, students are very active there. But this didn't come from the landscape that we live in. So clearly there is we never have explored the processes by which we at least got security and the right to complain. Because we haven't done that, we don't know why we might get security but not a freedom from fear. And that we do get the right to complain but not the right to redress. So I think it is important that we should start talking about those questions now. Because it's wonderful, JNU, we made this presentation in the Verma Commission, what was wonderful was that we were listened to. And we made a few points there which I want to address right now because I think there will be a basis for discussion in the future. One of the suggestions that we made, there were a number of problems with the bill, I won't go in, and everything that we said was wrong with the bill has been accepted by the Verma Commission. But as you know, that the Verma Commission really has no standing now. Its effects have been, its proposals have been effectively undone by the ordinance. But one of the things we said was that don't treat JNU as this special model place, and we believe that for the Vishaka judgment to be implemented, it is absolutely necessary that complaints committees that are constituted under it must have representation from all levels of the workplace. That is, you must have Karamcharis on it, you must have students on it, and so you have to create a broadly democratic committee. And unfortunately, the Verma Commission did not accept what we said, because JNU is a special place. Today we must ask ourselves, even though I said this to the Verma Commission, that even within our university structures, and even within the functioning of GS Cash, there might be representatives from Karamcharis and students. But have we created an institution that actually democratizes the question and gives everybody equal say and equal voice? So, you build an institution, it is necessary for the community to critique it. Similarly, we said you must, these committees and these bills that you propose must have rules. Now, in the first few years that GS Cash existed, because the rules were derived at, so exactly in this room, there used to be meetings called by the GS Cash time, and we would all sit and scribble away and discuss various stuff. That the idea was that the community was creating a framework for which it was to work in. Now, how far is that framework something that we have been able to extend beyond the boundaries of GS Cash, and how far have we been able to use that framework to make an institution which belongs to the community? Might sit in the Pink Palace, if you forgive my French, it might sit there, but it belongs to the community. And clearly what has happened is that this confidentiality issue, which is a really important oath that GS Cash members must take, have imposed a certain distance between the community and the community. So that questions of like, for example, Pratiksha said domestic violence. Now, as a member of the current GS Cash, I have to think, oh God, I'm going to have to do an inquiry about it. And that's under it's a police complaint. So, have we taken the functions of, have we extended the functions of GS Cash? And is the right to complain and the responsibility of inquiry into complaints actually A, divested the entire community of its responsibility to continue to address these issues, and B, actually hamstrung the institution that we so lovingly created? So I was associated with the GS Cash for the first 3-4 years, and one of the reasons that I felt it was really important that I stopped being on GS Cash was, I didn't succeed in what I'm going to tell you, but was the idea that is GS Cash enough? Because since for many years our whole attention was focused on GS Cash, are questions of equality to be raised only through punitive bodies? So what has happened? Why does JNU not have any semblance of a women's movement like you have in Delhi University, where the rights of all women students and Karamcharis and teachers can be articulated as a set of rights? I know we are a wonderful place, but are we wonderful enough that given our responsibilities right now, that we are ahead, so to speak, of other institutions, what are we doing to even either go further ahead or to extend what we have to even Munich around us? That's something that we haven't done. So, maybe I think I should actually stop now because I think I've thrown in a lot of questions. So while, I think it is important that we should think of another pressure body or another set of pressure bodies where complainants, for example, they have only GS Cash to rely upon. Do you think that women complainants to GS Cash don't require support? That's what women's groups do across the country, actually aid, and it's their experience that got us the Verma report. That's something I think that perhaps we should be discussing today. What we've done, is it enough, or how terrible it is? Or is GSCAS something that we want? Because I think it is only through the process of critique that we can make this institution stronger. So thank you, I'm going to stop.
Thank you very much, Pratiksha and Aisha. I now invite questions, and please introduce yourselves and also clarify to whom your questions are addressed. Questions, comments, suggestions, anything?
Hi, I'm Malarika with Women's Studies. So my question is, it's not exactly a question, something that I wanted to kind of clarify more from Aisha, that when GSCAS was formed, if I remember correctly, in 1999 when probably the first elections were held. And as a student at that time in JNU, I do remember that there was, what you are pointing out now was exactly the fear among a large section of the students, that it will only be a punitive body, and that is why what Isha also mentioned, that the whole question of making sexual harassment gender neutral and the ability to kind of making the provision to accuse women of being assaulters, not assaulted. That was one of the most important issues which was discussed among several sections of the student body. And that is why there was the movement to put a man within GSCAS, because from its inception GSCAS had this inbuilt problem. So I think it is important to reevaluate it, as you are pointing out now.
So if we evaluate the composition is what you want to suggest.
I mean, not only the composition, but also what you have been pointing out in terms of the mechanisms. Because I think composition is part of the way a body functions. So,
you see, I don't think, this we've been hearing since December that women police officers are not more sensitive, and that's absolutely true. It's also the case, I don't think that if you have women only, it's going to, this body, I'm not saying that you have to be dissatisfied with it, but dissatisfaction is an essential part of being able to move on and grow. So whatever critique we might have of the institution that we created, I don't think it's, the issue is of the biological sex of the persons elected on it. It's a question of representing us on it. It is a question of gender and sensibility. But one other thing which I ought to mention, that in the first few years again, precisely because it was gender neutral, because there is an anti-sexual harassment policy, JNU saw the first, and I think it is now not active, a group which was for LGBT rights. And I remember going to their meetings and listening to them speak, and they said it is actually the protection that GSCAS affords. Because, if you're looking at 97, 98, where even the High Court judgment wasn't there, decriminalizing homosexuality, that they felt that it was the fact that you had an institution which looked at sexual harassment rather than sexual deviance was a protection for it. So I think that the gender neutral component is an extremely essential protection. And for those of you who don't know, in Delhi University, which has a similar policy, a vice principal of Ramjas College actually sexually harassed and molested a number of young male students, a male vice principal. And in fact, if any redressal was possible, was precisely because you have gender neutral policy.
I'm Sneha from SLS.
Just that also.
This is not also. I'm loud enough, I don't need.
No, we are recording it.
Just to continue with what Aisha said, actually in JNU also we had a similar case, not of a faculty, but it certainly was of our relationship, where in hostel we had complained. Well, the complaint didn't start that way, but it eventually turned out that there was this boy sharing a hostel room, and there were guys who were senior to him who were, indulging in sexual violence, and he was so intimidated and so embarrassed about it that he couldn't speak up about it. It was only when he was sent in for psychological counseling that we figured out this is what is happening. So our relationships of all kinds, and to answer this, I do think that having a male member does help, because often we don't anticipate. I think GSCAT has done a great job in anticipating this.
I mean, another accident that I just wanted to point out, that JNU got its first elected woman president after the formation of GSCAT, and now it's not even an issue. Right? But you never had, there was one other female JNUSU president, but she took over halfway through the term, because it was like a by-election. But the first woman elected student union president was after GSCAT was formed.
Other questions, comments, suggestions? Lots of issues have been thrown up. Yeah.
One, I want to ask you, what is in the JNU community, especially faculty, is GSCAT accepted, and what do people feel about GSCAT? Do you have a sense? I mean, when you critique after this is an institution, and I'm wondering whether the average, what is the general?
I think you're a better place to say, answer your own question.
No, I'm just saying we need to do something. That's what I'm trying to ask. Is there something, because even the representation of this hall will find it very huge. That is one thing. The other is, I mean, if there is something special about JNU and about the way in which we relate to each other, what is it that there is, and can we have more of that? I mean, we know what it is. And I remember in one of the meetings, there was a young student who said that maybe the need for courses, especially say, the very young students coming from school of languages and all that, to have a much larger sense of what a certain question of attitude, the question of thinking very differently, and also the preventive kind of measure. So I'm just.
You want to respond?
I mean, I think it would be a good idea if people talked about what they think is. I mean, I don't really, I have things to say, but I don't want to say. Yes, and I will say. Fine.
This is just to sort of think with some of the kinds of issues that have come up here, and for the moment, what I want to say, one of the reasons why we actually thought we'd have the meeting today, and the way in which the panels were constituted, which is we are on the same sort of set of discussions, bringing students, faculty, and people who are faculty but part of administration together, so that we can actually start having a discussion across the board. And I don't think that that's extremely important, because otherwise the way in which this discussion often happens is we assume that there is a kind of subject body out there, i.e. the students, where many things are happening, it needs to get sorted out, it needs to get worked out, then they come in appeal to some other kind of sort of, court of law kind of thing, where things will get settled or not. And I think that's time to kind of disrupt that. And to some extent, my response to what you're saying, Geeta, is really this, that I feel, I was a student here many, many years ago, and I left in '86, and I returned to teach 20 years after. I was struck by the fact that far less than what I had expected, the kind of debate that you're speaking about in terms of a women's movement, amongst faculty, the JNUTA, or any of the kinds of bodies which represent teachers, or the debate that's actually happening, is non-existent. In fact, in our individual capacities, we are engaged in all manners of things. In terms of producing a vibrant debate on any political issue, actually in this campus in which as a collective we come together. It's not existent. Delhi University has more of a Jamia has Jamia TA is far more radical, it seems to me, than JNU TA has ever been. So I think we also need to reflect very seriously, otherwise it will all become, the way in which you tell the story of GS Cash, Aisha, is so interesting precisely because you talk about it as a product of a movement, whereas it's become our official body. And if we need to engage this again, we need to actually talk about the fact that there is a peculiar disconnect between politics and all that we understand by way of politics and the way in which the institutional and other life of this university is conducted. There is absolutely no meeting ground for that. So in that sense, this is trying to open up a political space via the medium of our kind of fora to think about how do we address these issues again, how do we bring back questions of whether it's sexuality or love or violence, which have been vibrant questions for the women's movement, back into our discussions here on this campus. Seems to me it's just completely not there, except in, say, huddles when we get together and here and there and talk about it, or in, people's offices or in particular classrooms. So this is just to think with that, Yeah.
Can I say something? Sure. I had an interesting experience which I also found rather disappointing. You see, one of the things I do is, when there's some, we have girl students and we have boy students, and there are enormous problems in the hostel. There's no point in saying there aren't. And sometimes they land up at my doorstep when, an MMS is created and there's a girl who's absolutely shattered, and there's a boy who needs to be rusticated, or even a girl who needs to be. Now, one such incident did happen which we kept under wraps, because obviously these are not things one talks about. There were lots of wardens who knew about it. And after that happened, I said that, we should have some sort of counseling in hostels. There are lots of women's groups nowadays who come, who talk in a hostel, and they are very interactive. That is, they really open up subjects. That's how I got to know Nandini Rao, for example. And I suggested it to wardens. Everybody said yes. But no warden has to date done it. Nobody took interest in it. The case was forgotten. The girls and boys were back where they were. And then ultimately I tried 2-3 times, and I had addresses, I had emails, I had dates, I had everything. I had worked out everything. But then, as you're saying, there was very little interest in this issue. So, we do need to look at ourselves. And I think the only person who's actually got a counselor on campus is Ajay, Dr. Ajay Kumar in, adult education. And nobody seems to know about it. He's hired 2 counselors who do a fairly good job. And it's better that they sit in the SSS than if they sit in the health center. Because if they sit in the health center, they're seen as shrinks. And nobody wants to go there because you don't visit such people, and there's something wrong with you if you go to see somebody in the health center about that. I can understand that. And these 2 girls whom I think there was 1 boy and 1 girl he recruited. I think we are now to a second round. They were quite good, and enormous number of students went to them, which means that there is need for counseling on this campus. Long before it reaches GS Cash, there is need. And just because I'm a woman and I'm the rector, I hear terrible stories sometimes. I feel very bad about it. So we do have things on campus which do need to be addressed. And GS Cash is only one aspect of it. I think long before that, we need to look at ourselves and what sort of support structures we have created for students. And this is something that has been worrying me a great deal. A lot of students come to see me simply because I've been here a long time and they know me. And as I said, because I'm a woman, but otherwise, or they go and see some warden they know. But otherwise, a lot of them are completely on their own, and the levels of depression that is there among women students is quite high in this university. I think, as Pratiksha said, we need a survey. We need a survey, how do women look after themselves, what do they do, all the kind of broken hearts that you have on campus, these are realities. These are things which one hears about from one's students and so on. So I think these are also issues that we need to look at, and what kind of a society we are. It's not all that nice. And also it's one explanation that was given to me was that, girls come and boys come from small towns and they come here and they find total freedom here. You can do what you like. Whereas back home, it's a small town, their parents would have a lot of control over them and all the neighbors know them and it's a place they've grown up in. So suddenly they are entirely on their own. So I think a proper set of counseling which is in place would be very, very useful. And I think these are things we need to think about, some sort of an institutional system. I would be very willing to help, and money is never a problem in these things. Ultimately, one can always find it and it doesn't cost much. But this is something that one does need to, and if you're thinking, as was said, administration, faculty, everybody coming together and doing something, this is something that could be easily very well done.
Are there any younger people who would like to come at this stage? Because it would be nice really for all of us, yeah.
Yeah, the discussion, I initially didn't know that, at least I didn't know that it's more of like a JNU-centered kind of discussion, so suddenly I can say something about that. One thing Professor Pai or Professor Roy said, in the sense, one of the most, I can't have a reference to the past, but at least for the present, one of the starting lack of these campuses are, as you said, a particularly a women's kind of not a space, I wouldn't say, use the word movement. A particularly women's kind of a movement, because everybody who has witnessed to the last two elections to the GS CAT would say that it's just a matter of, who would represent a particular political stream, rather than, who would pick and choose a member from your organization, whoever is the best, act person, who would be most representative person according to a lot of other political criteria that we know that's present in all other elections. So just she needs to be a woman, and then there are other whatever criteria that you have. Other than that, I think none of the political organizations, don't need to talk about the right-wing organizations here, but at least the left-wing organizations don't take up that kind of an initiative where they would want not just as their representatives, but as an independent or on their own kind of women's movement in campus. Because most of the active people, activists or active people in the campus who belong invariably to one organization or the other wouldn't want to come out and have a different movement kind of a thing. I think a few years back there was a small initiative in the sense of having that kind of called as a link between the academics that happen in terms of the feminist academics and the kind of left political movement in campus kind of a link, but which didn't go much forward. So I think that kind of a link is, on the one hand, it's important because just like Dr. Arunima said, that organic political kind of a link is no longer there between the student community and GS CAT. Now it's mostly seen as a military institution at best. So, and people are rather people who didn't go to GS CAT unless it's it's an extreme extent that you have to safeguard yourself from something worse. So, and I was thinking, and on the one hand, it's important to have such a movement to keep ourselves lively as political beings and as women, and to have discussions, to intervene outside the campus also. But on the other hand, I was feeling this, like Professor Pai said, the kind of there is a strong. I think one of the importances of a kind of solidarity among women in terms of, say, not just in terms of emotional or the kind of issues that Professor Pai mentioned, but otherwise also the kind of lack of emotional security network system quite present. I don't know if it's because the politics is a bit more mechanized than should be in fact. So there's a complete lack of that kind of a security system, like a national security system for the students and even for people who are otherwise engaged in many things. So even for people, so that kind of a more less formal kind of platform also can emerge from this kind of an active movement.
No, I completely agree with you, and I completely agree with you, and even as faculty, that's precisely what one misses, because one doesn't necessarily belong to certain kinds of political formations. And when we were students, we formed the gender study group, the Forum Against Sexual Harassment. We used to not only receive, it was not sort of limited to receiving complaints, but it was a wonderful space of solidarity for us. And even as faculty, that's precisely what I miss in JMU, so I'm glad you said this.
If I can also just tell you, so GSCASH was actually spearheaded, there was a gender studies forum, because the Teachers Association made it a precondition for okaying I was a member of the first 3 GSCASHs, but then the Teachers Association made it a precondition, so to ratify the rules, they would only accept the rules if Gender Studies Forum was thrown off GSCASH. And since Gender Studies Forum was 20 of us, we decided that we didn't want to hold the institution to ransom. And we said, who are we? We're not an NGO or something. So we actually resigned our membership. But that also killed the Gender Studies Forum.
Any other comments or sharing anybody would like to do? Okay, then I'll try and wrap up this session and open up pass it on to Arunima to open up the next session. I think one of the issues that Pratiksha highlighted, and I think which has come up again and again, is that there is no substitute for prevention, and we need to work much more systematically than we have done in terms of thinking about prevention as something that we build into our everyday practice. And here I just also want to share the experience a young colleague had recently, because I think we need to also interrogate much more closely than we're doing at the moment the attitudes that people in positions of power in this university have on issues of gender. Because those sometimes we take for granted are progressive and what have you, and sometimes they don't turn out to be that. Sometimes, or maybe more often than sometimes, they don't turn out to be as progressive as we think they would be. And I know, for instance, that a young colleague who recently took over as warden was asked where her husband was located and how her husband would commute. I'm sure that if it was a male colleague who had joined, he would not have been asked those questions. And this was asked by somebody fairly high up in the administrative hierarchy. So I think when we are talking about sensitization and all that it involves, these are everyday routine attitudes that we take for granted, and at some level we need to begin to interrogate these and question these and bring these out for discussion. And it should be something where we don't assume that faculty or high-level people in the administration are, in a certain sense, free from these kinds of biases. Because ultimately it's these biases that go into a whole range of acceptance of different kinds of sexual violence, even as we ourselves may not be actually engaging in those acts of sexual violence. So I think attitudinal change is something that we need to work on. The second issue that I would like to raise before us, and I think that these I think is a fairly large number who have come here, in spite of the fact that there are dozens of things happening on campus and elsewhere today. Yeah, but even so, I think it's a fairly large number. And I think that's something that, having been part of GSCASH at one point of time and now part of the Women's Studies program for a certain span of time, I think sometimes it tends to be seen as the responsibility of either JSCASH or the WSP to take charge of the campus in these matters. And I think we need to broad-base this much more than what is happening at present. It's something where each and every center and each and every school as well as each and every hostel should see it as their responsibility as well. And that broad-basing has to be done. Because it's not that the handful of women and men who might be in JSCASH or in the WSP can actually undertake some of the things that Pratiksha has listed out for us. I mean, because I think all of those things need to be done, but it's not something that either of these two little groups can do. It's much more broad-based, and it needs to be widened out in a very big way. Yeah, and I think that some of the issues that have come up in terms of the breakdowns that we see within the university system, we need to acknowledge those and then see how we can move beyond those, because I think there is a recognition that certain kinds of communication have broken down, and what can we do to restore those, I think, are issues that we need to address. I now hand over to Avni.
I'll just masquerade as you. Can I ask Sujitra and Abhiruchi and Sneha?
No, actually they are all there.
Are they?
Are they yours?
You insist, is it?
No, I mean, people should be able to.
If anybody wants their name, they can take it. Or if you want to be Pratiksha also, you're welcome. So much. Before I ask the panel to speak to us, and since this is a panel with 3 people, I would request that everybody restrict themselves to 15 minutes if possible, so that we can probably by then everybody will feel a little bit more relaxed and there will be discussion, given that we have 2 younger friends here who will speak to us, and in fact we'll start with the students first. But prior to that, just 2 or 3 different types of things about what prompted today's discussion. Of course, partly it was to mark the second anniversary of the December 16th gang rape and violence. But also there is an interesting irony of holding it on Valentine's Day, and so why not speak about violence, which is the other side of love. So I think there is something that we do need to think about here. One, the kind of issue that came up in the small discussion we were having just now, which is about this business about the women's movement and feminist politics on JNU campus, which is a question that I think individually and for some of us in groups has concerned us for, I think, quite a while. Many of us have spoken about this again and again, and I certainly have spoken about it to those friends of mine with whom I speak about these issues here, and also those students of mine with whom we discuss these things, because what has struck me as something that is scarily absent is the presence of any kind of vibrant feminist position in public politics here. And that is a question, that is a silence that does need to be spoken about. And one of the kinds of reasons why we thought we would have this is actually to be able to open that up, because there are many students who are deeply concerned about this as well. And this is an issue that we thought that if it could be brought together in this context, it would be something that would be important. The second is to do with this business about love and violence. And again, an issue that I have heard about now in the last 7 years that I've been teaching here is the extraordinarily violent kind of issues that seem to be coming up in sort of intimate partner relationships between students.
which is not surprising because that's intimate partner violence is true everywhere. So why should JNU is not exceptional? But the fact that this is a small campus makes it that much more intense and that much more difficult to handle in some ways. So there is, it kind of, you know, there's a certain kind of way in which it festers and it seeps through in manners that makes discussion impossible but makes lives actually quite difficult. And the other is the kind of violence and sexual harassment that exists in the context, and one particular context which I have found dismaying, that between teachers and students. And I think that there's again been a lot of angry, not public but private protests about this, and I have had many occasions in which students have spoken to me eloquently and angrily about what is actually happening on campus. And it has, you know, it has concerned many of us deeply about the fact that we are not bringing it out into public. So, you know, one of the things that we at least thought in women's studies is that we should do this. So that was another kind of reason for bringing this into the public forum here for discussion. The third is the question of redressal. Again, an issue that has come up today, but an issue that has concerned all of us for a long period of time. Let me give you a small story, an anecdote about a very dear student of mine some years ago, who went through a very, very difficult sort of situation in an intimate partner kind of situation. It was awful. But two things about it still sort of stay with me, and I'm dismayed when I think about it, and it concerns me deeply. One was when the manner in which she came to me. It had to do with a very dear colleague of mine, a male colleague in another department, saying to me that, look, there is a student who's going through a really bad time. I told her, please go and speak to Arunima, she'll know what to do. Now, I'm struck by the fact that a male colleague of mine, who's so sensitive, could not take it on himself and felt that she had to be sent off to a woman colleague, and that to a woman colleague in women's studies. And I think there is something about that we do need to think about who addresses these issues, right? One. The second was the fact that she did, because of our urging, fight in GS Cash, and of course nothing happened, right? So the fact of, I mean, I think if we do a statistic of, you know, the numbers of cases in which no result has actually, yeah, that's the thing. So, and this is the most depressing part of the story of non-redressal. And again, GS Cash is not exceptional. That's the state of the country. Right? So it's only because we're talking about our campus that I thought that it might be worth thinking about. And in addition, in response to two of the things, just two of the very important things raised by Pratiksha and Aisha. One about syllabi, I agree fully with you, Pratiksha. I think it is a very important question about what is it about the structure of syllabi and the manners in which we conceptualize these issues. And I fully agree with you. Apart from the fact of, you know, just doing a random check on what gets taught in classrooms and so on and so forth, just also sort of raising a really serious discussion around that. I think it's really important, and this is the time to do that, because I think much of this flows out, you know, when we speak about attitudes and so on and so forth, it's about what we teach in our classrooms, because at the end of the day, if this still becomes a non-issue, right, the subject is something else, you know, and it's not that it should only be there in legal studies classroom or women's studies classroom. So there are interesting issues around that. And the second, of course, Aisha, which I said at that point, I mean, I'm always struck by, you know, your narration of the GS Cash story, because it sort of, you know, identifies so many different elements of JNU's own development. But I think what I was really struck by is the question about the complicated responses to gender justice, and why this campus simply hasn't been able to open up, apparently despite its progressive credentials, that kind of space. And I think that's something we need to think about. What is it about quote-unquote progressive politics that silences these kinds of things? So there is a disconnect and a discomfort, and that's why we thought that we would initiate this discussion. So with just that, may I ask Ujitra Panaya to speak first? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ujitra. I'm a first-year student of PhD in Sociology. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today. When the Delhi gang rape happened in December, I wasn't in Delhi, but I saw a lot of the protests and what was going on television, and closely followed it in different forms of social media that are widely available now. Now, I remember sitting at that point and feeling extremely happy, because I can't remember the last time so many people came out on the streets together, protesting against, asking for this city and this country to become a more sort of a just space for women, while I was also mindful of the kind of things that the protest didn't touch upon and the usual disclaimers that we keep talking about. So what is it about the movement that I think I personally wish to celebrate? I think the movement sort of reinforces the fact that rape is political, that rape has to do with the politics of gender, and the fact that in a country like ours where women are only seen either as goddesses or in the relational sort of a diminutive form in the form of mothers, daughters, sisters, wives, etc., and not as full citizens of this country who demand and should be realized, their full citizenship should be realized even if they are painted and dented. I also think rape is political because it is a form of punishment which is meted out against Dalit women and Muslim women who are seen as custodians of honor for the community at large. It is political because it is the means that the Indian Army and the police tell us that without it they cannot protect us. And I think I was there for the anti-Modi protest in SRCC and the extremely misogynist and sexist manner in which the police handled us. And after that, the cowardly act of murder that the Indian state committed in terms of killing off Afzal quietly. And the protest that followed after that, and again the extremely misogynist manner in which the police handled the protesters. So that speaks volume. I think rape is also political because once a woman enters into a marital contract with a man, she apparently enters legitimate, non-coercive, consensual, reciprocal and loving sexual relations, and the state and its judiciary have trouble realizing otherwise. Rape is political because it is about the politics of moral policing, where systems still believe that women seek rape or entice men by the way they talk, walk, dress, and hence the solution lies in controlling and censoring women's movement further. Rape is political because in order to ascertain that a woman is raped, she is subjected to another rape through a two-finger test, and then has to shoulder all the shame of the world and not the perpetrators of the despicable act. This movement has strongly asserted that rape is political and it has nothing to do with sexual desire, and hence castration is not a solution, and neither is death penalty which allows the state to wash off all responsibility. Rape is political because in order to bring any kind of change, we need to recognize the patriarchal value sets that are imbibed by women as much as men and are knit into our everyday existence and the power relations starting from the family to the politicians. Rape is political, and this movement has shown that we need to recognize it for what it is. But this is something, all of what I've said has been widely written, discussed, there have been numerous public meetings around it. What I want to speak, spend the latter half of what I speak is about the JNU context, something which is much closer home and perhaps explored much less by virtue of being that. So if JNU is sort of being paraded as a model, like Professor Kidwai said, outside, let's also integrate further and ask for ourselves what is it that we understand when we see JNU being paraded as a model outside. So what is the gender nerve or the quotient, the gender quotient of this campus? How do larger issues of sexual violence, whether it be cases of assault, molestation, eve-teasing, or unequal gender relations, whether it be in the political, the academic, our dhaba chai sessions, our intimate relationships, make their home here and normalize themselves over time? So let me speak about this case that happened in the month of October last year. And many of you must have heard about this. So there was an attempt to rape / sexual molestation. There are different versions floating around of that story, which happened in October. 4 days later, there was a pamphlet which was brought out by JNUSU, condemning what had happened and simultaneously reiterating what we hear many a times, that this was a black mark on the otherwise gender-just campus of JNU. Following this, a bunch of women students got together and they brought out a write-up asking the JNUSU for further clarifications for how was it that GS Cash was going to take it up, sort of asking them the numerous versions that were floating around, what was the version that was to be believed and how was it to be pursued further. Once this pamphlet was brought out, I think it acted as a pressure technique, and so the other left parties on campus took out positions sort of condemning it, sort of at least referring to it. That was done. Once the women's pamphlet was out, there was also a simultaneous pamphlet which was brought out by UDSF, the United Dalit Students Federation, telling the women that they were extremely cautious in their articulation of the case. In the meantime, the case was going on in the sexual harassment cell, the GS Cash. The man involved here, there were repeated summons which were being sent out to him. He was freely loitering around on campus while the summons were being sent out, and he never bothered showing up for them. He did go to the GS Cash office once, and I think to demand for a copy of the complaint that had been filed against him. He was simultaneously also pressurizing the girl who was a Delhi University student, and so were his friends by being outside her hostel and the whole politics of intimidation. So while there was a bunch of women who got together, and extremely timely intervention, a much required one, I want to think with you here about the silence that largely pervaded this issue. While we live in a campus where perhaps you don't even need to open the newspaper in the morning because the walls are so covered, and there are opinion pieces, there are newspaper excerpts, all of it. So why was there such a silence around this issue? Was the silence because the guy involved was a Dalit student and the girl perhaps not? Or was the silence because when we look at questions of, say, intersectionality of caste and gender, this sort of self-imposed progressive politics of ours in which sort of all of us have been initiated in is not complicated enough to sort of take a position vis-a-vis it? Was the silence because sort of our political academic understandings, like I said, are not nuanced enough to deal with when there are two competing identities pitted against each other? Was the silence also because sexual harassment is seen as a responsibility of the GS Cash alone? And like Arunima was saying, where a male colleague asked the student to go and speak to her, because there is a women's studies program here, are they going to be taking care of the rest of it? Having spoken about this case, I want to briefly talk about the academic realm here. By that I mean, what is it that we read, discuss, break our heads, perhaps lose our sleep about? I know Arunima will differ because she tells us we don't read, and perhaps rightly so. So, in a discussion group, if we were to sit around, as I have been part of many discussion groups here, sort of a naive inference, but I'll still share it with you. If you were to sit around and there were the works of, say, Marx, Foucault, Agamben, and if people in the group hadn't read it, there would be an increasing sense of discomfort, there would be a feeling of inadequacy, there would be a wish at least to go back to your rooms and sort of read it, and perhaps at that point also to bring out half-baked ideas or whatever you had heard about these thinkers. Is this feeling of inadequacy and discomfort also conveyed when we look at works of, say, Butler, Nancy Fraser, Wendy Brown, Mugadam, Sharmila Rege? The list is long, and you get my point. And even if the works of Butler are read, what is it that we read? Do we read her work which looked at gender trouble, all of those? Do we look at her work post-2611? What is it that we write in our dissertations and things that we work on? Do we use gender as a variable that we work on? If we want to work on gender in its entirety, do our dissertation guides allow us to do it? Or do they just tell us, oh, put it as a variable in the end so that you look progressive enough, you've accommodated all the debates possibly on the table. Since I've spoken about sort of the academic realm a bit, I want to look at the extremely uncomfortable relationships that many women students share with their male supervisors on this campus, and I think Arunima has brought that out. From speaking to many women on this campus, I think I could broadly script two ways in which these relationships of power work themselves out. The first is the one which is a little difficult perhaps to articulate, pin down. This is one where the guide, the male guide, sort of, all the transgressions are couched in a language of intellectualism. The woman has a sense that there is a line being crossed. She is extremely uncomfortable, but she has trouble articulating it, and the guide sort of plays on in the grey area to his benefit. The second kinds are the one where, it's easier to understand. The guide kind of keeps calling you after office hours to his office. He calls you home when there is nobody else around. He perhaps insists on a harmless cup of coffee outside, and when you don't know what else to do and you turn up, the guide kind of has nothing much to say but makes small talk. So while Professor Kidwai has said that students who have managed to file cases, and extremely brave ones to manage to file cases against their male supervisors, they have also discontinued their studies on this campus. So how is it that people perhaps can begin talking about these and reaching out to women who are sort of trapped in these sort of relationships where the power hierarchies are equally clearly discernible and work against them? Having spoken about the academic realm, I want to speak about what happens when we sort of step outside our center. And here I want to, again, perhaps a naive point, but I'm sure all of you have heard the way abuses are used. So, bencho, chutia, maki, benti, motherfucker. You get a general drift of the way things are being used. Now, you can sort of accuse me of harping on a sense of political correctness, but you would also agree that political correctness is not just public acts of censoring. They're also they are also sort of a distorted reflection of the way we understand and way we locate ourselves in larger politics. So I want to ask, why is it that when it comes to expressing our anger through abuses, it has to start and end with the invocation of the vagina? Are women's bodies and voices to be selectively inserted only to be animatized, ridiculed, and referred to in this derogatory manner? Yes, language or our ways of expression is not a matter in itself, and I'm not interested solely in the semantics of the issue. But it is equally true that it is connected to our everyday lives and practices, and in the sometimes subtle ways in which patriarchal paradigms work by showcasing male values, needs, and articulations as universal. Moving on from here, I was yesterday at Shipra's Cultural Night. I know some of us who are here were also there and would share my response to it. So it was very evident what would get the loudest cheer and the kind of whistles that would happen. So the ones with the jhatkas or Madhuri's Choli Ke Piche Kya Hai number, which was performed too, was the one that got the loudest cheer from the crowd. Now there was one song which was performed too, in which there were two women dancing, and they sort of pulled a guy on stage and they were whistling and sort of hooting, sort of teasing him in this comical manner. And there was a bunch of men who were standing behind who were extremely uncomfortable with what they saw. So, and this is how they articulated their discomfort. They said, "Oye chakke, down, down," sort of how the left vocabulary of, campaign sort of knits in there, and they say left, "Oye chakke, down, down, kahan hai tumhari mardangi, aise thodi na tumhe milegi koi aurat." So it's very clear, they're very singular ideas of what constitutes a man, what constitutes his mardangi, and what is a true mard to do but to jump and pounce on a woman in order to acquire her. And if he transgresses or doesn't behave in the way one identifies what a man is, then the immediate punishment that is evoked is the feminine, which needs to be sort of done away with, or like Professor Bakshi was talking about, how homophobes are extremely privileged. Either it would be a chakke or there would be an accusation of being in a same-sex relationship. So sort of two instances from our informal spaces outside the center. I now want to briefly talk about intimate partner violence and the kind of relationships that people have on this campus. I think that, like Arunima was saying, there's no better day to do it when love is being sort of paraded in its most commercial and heterosexist manner around. Is the grand narrative of love above and beyond politics? How does love act as sort of a cloak which legitimizes intimate partner violence? So when the attempt to rape / sexual molestation happened last semester in this campus, the rumor mills were extremely busy. So the kind of things that were being said was that the woman was in a relationship with a man. She had been drinking with him outside. Why is it that she even thought about going to his room at night? Now these things that are being said, just like the way the politicians outside have been speaking, insinuate the same thing, that the girl was responsible for what happened to her, and hence, this is what happens when you do, if you go sort of drinking around with a man at night and having dinner and walking back to his hostel. But it also sort of brings about the questions about what is it that we protest. And there was a sort of a write-up I had read during the Delhi gang rape thing, which said that would people have protested so loudly on the streets if the gang rape had been of a sex worker? Would people have protested so loudly if, say, leave alone a sex worker perhaps in this case, if the gang rape had been of a woman who had been in a relationship and the rape had happened within the four walls of the room, sort of sanctioned within a marriage, love, and the rest of the whole thing that goes on. So, and I think I just want to briefly sort of stop to say that the Justice Verma Committee recommendations perhaps is one of those rare documents that brings in marital rape, and I quote, it says, "Marital or other relationship between the perpetrator or victim is not a valid defense against the crimes of rape or sexual violence," unquote. And it is extremely important that this joke of an ordinance is scrapped and sort of we work towards it. Now, coming back to intimate partner violence on this campus. So, I know of many women on this campus who are in relationships that are extremely violent. They are physically violent. And if they're not physically violent, then these relationships are of the kind where a woman constantly circumscribes her needs, her choices, her dreams, where she is going to go, what she is going to wear, who she is going to meet, how much money she is going to spend, her dreams, her academic pursuits, all of it around the whims of the partner in question. I also know of many relationships in which the men refuse to use any sort of contraception while having sex. So as we come together to understand sexual violence, can we also perhaps start by collectively talking and questioning the other forms of violence that starts from our own intimate spaces? Finally, I want to sort of conclude by looking at our spaces of protest to this many said and unsaid forms of violence on campus. Now, just like the protests outside sort of need to be steered away from the right-wing lobby, the human rights walas and the huge array of NGOs that they bring, the discussion on this campus needs to go beyond the rhetorics of gender justice, which is constantly thrown at us and invoked before every public meeting that starts, telling us that how gender just JNU is. And yes, perhaps when the outside space is crumbling, it is commendable that we have a sort of a relatively safe enough space for women to move around, but does it begin and end there? How can we sort of come together while being constantly sensitive of the fact that there is no unitary category woman and there are no easy sort of solidarities that can be forged? How is it that we can still talk about and not sort of be paralyzed by these competing and multiple forms of patriarchy that are operating? So to sort of summarize, I've tried to sort of start off by telling you what is it about the Delhi gang rape and the movement that followed, what is it that I thought I personally gathered from it. I then moved on to speak about the academic realm, which was to do with the kind of books that we read, the dissertation topics we worked with, the extremely uncomfortable relationships, and sort of revisited the question of sexual harassment through that many women students have with their male supervisors. I then spoke about sort of informal spaces of cultural night or the way abuses are used. And then I sort of moved on to look at intimate partner violence in relationships that happen on campus. As a conclusion, final, sexual violence might appear at times to be something out there or as a last or higher instance of violence, but its formation and existence is subtly knit in our everyday existence, and hence our protest needs to start with our immediate as much as it needs to be in solidarity with the larger process of democratization. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Abhiruchi. I'm a student of CPS MPhil first year. Taking a cue from the points that Ujitra raised, I thought that, the issue of sexual violence needed to be problematized in very many ways, and, drawing links between the larger movement that has been happening after the 16th December incident and the more routinized kinds of violence or routinized form of patriarchal control. There is a very, very strong link, and I feel that somewhere when we try to kind of denounce in very subtle ways that very strong link between these more overt acts of sexual violence in terms of brutalized incidents of rape happen, and very normal, casualized, subtle instances of deployment of patriarchal morality, patriarchal control on women's lives happen. This larger link is something I find very important to talk about. So I shall try to foreground that. And so I would like to talk really about the relationship between the political and the personal in the context of JNU as a political space. And obviously because we have an assumption of JNU as a left progressive campus. And, it extends to the personal spaces and academic spaces on campus. And so, I think that there are times when there is a need for having more expectations of our interpersonal, intimate partner relationships, where we kind of make a separation, both people, students, those who are politically active, and those who may not consider themselves politically active. But in a lot of these instances, especially regarding violence against women and patriarchal control, we draw a distinct line between the personal and the political. And I'll just elaborate by way of dividing my larger point in two sections. firstly, I'd like to talk about, beginning from, let's say, the CD incident that happened in Tapti Hostel, and how, like, this girl who was in a relationship with a guy who filmed her in the act of sex without her consent, and then subsequently circulated the CD. And obviously it was addressed at the institutional level and politically taken up by different organizations and forums. But also it went into a wide circulation on JNU. I mean, by the time it had already been taken up at the institutional level, most of the campus had already seen the CD. Now, the point is that I found that people who were denouncing the incident through political forums kind of found it unproblematic when people who were their acquaintances and people who were their friends were watching the CD in their private spaces. And I thought that, even people who are, and I'm not by what you're saying that everybody, but there is a way in which people, even those who are extremely politically conscious and assertive in the public and through public forums and political forums, treat these issues as almost apolitical issues when it comes to their private spaces. So somehow it was okay to view the CD and speak about it in the personal space, but it was criminal to talk about it in the private space in the similar way. So denouncing it publicly, but kind of watching it and enjoying it privately. So I think this is the space of silence, since we're also talking about when is it that we are speaking to choose, and when is it that we are almost making this choice, this tacit agreement amongst ourselves that, here perhaps this does not merit a conversation or political action or raising certain pointed questions even, because, that's okay. And also I think there is a way in which the assumption of this space as being inhabited by learned, intellectual, progressive people kind of gives it a different kind of a garb, where you can kind of speak of the same issue in a different manner publicly, and the same issue differently in a private space. So private space is unproblematic in that sense. And so the question of when is it that something requires institutional redress? And so women's own judgments about what is the point, what is the threshold at which they must report some incident institutionally, and only when it assumes, say, a certain degree of seriousness. Until that point, perhaps it is okay, and some kinds of behavior, I mean the kinds of subtle ways in which this control is deployed was, I think, detailed in a very nuanced manner by Ujitra. The relationship between a male supervisor or a guide and a female student, and the very extremely subtle ways in which this power is deployed. And also these are the ways in which it also is very difficult to report these kind of instances because usually one does wait till it acquires a certain fair degree of seriousness and sort of visible markers of harm. So, I think that there is a way in which when we sidestep or overlook patriarchal control or various forms in which this control is deployed in academic spaces and in personal spaces, there is a way in which we are in fact granting it legitimacy. And that granting of legitimacy to these acts in academic and personal spaces is in fact a very, very political act of validation. And therefore, I think the personal and the political, by not recognizing these instances of markedly political or carrying a political importance, we are actually granting them a very, very political legitimacy. I think there's another point which I think could, it's regarding women activists and how they perceive their own sexuality. And this question is important, I think, because there is a way in which women activists who condone sexual violence, sexual crime, and are very, very vociferously against, for gender justice and equality, will overlook these subtle ways of patriarchal control and moral control in their personal lives. So, instances of male protectionism, sexual control of women, would generally kind of not be issues which again merit a longer kind of a discussion, or kind of because one needs to ready oneself as a political activist also to partake of larger, more immediate, more important political problems. So I think that there is a way in which sexuality for them becomes somewhat of a hindrance, something to be overcome, and ultimately, which shows itself in a very systematic acquiring of masculine idiom of like bodily idiom, which of course is understood to be the neutral idiom of self-presentation, but obviously it's not neutral, it's extremely masculine. And I think that this is also a way of self-censure that women kind of impose upon them, because, and I think that this is coming from the larger argument about women being responsible for bringing upon heckling, harassment upon themselves, because really, if they could, if they could, that drawing attention towards features of their own body, and if they could overcome these in a specific way, then perhaps these issues could be resolved. I think there is a certain way again in which not only this is an extension of this larger patriarchal moral ideology, but also again in a way to subordinate issues of patriarchal control and thereby depoliticizing them. And this I'm saying because it's not only people who are politically inactive or politically not very conscious who do them, but women who are extremely politically active who sometimes think that it is important for them to overlook or kind of sidestep their own sexuality. And I thought that this point largely that we were making, that Professor Kidwai and Agra was also making, about women's forums, women's political forums, and whether they could create a different kind of sensibility and consciousness towards women issues. I think this is a question that requires a lot of thinking, and I think this question is very important, especially in today's context, because movement is going, we are trying, at least through different forums, to keep the momentum of the movement which started after the 16 December incident, in which a lot of people termed as middle class movement. We tried later on to kind of keep the momentum up and try to bring in an intervention from the left end. And I thought that these questions, or the question of the formation of an all-women's forum on campus, becomes very important with regard to this movement that is going outside, because we who are associated with that movement, I think it also gives you a certain kind of a potential to handle these different issues, or the same issue at different levels, even on campus. And I think that all women solidarities could be formed, and political forums like such could be formed. And perhaps I leave that question up to all of you all to respond. And I'm throwing a couple of these questions and some bit of my own speculations out for your response. Thank you.
Thank you. Could I ask Sneha Sudar to speak? Sneha is TTC Life Sciences.
Yeah, I'm Sneha from the Life Sciences. And I do what's called biophysics, not a very feminine subject in that sense. And you already know subjects are gender. And listening to most people speaking here, I couldn't help feeling a sense of resonance. I kind of feel tempted to respond to everything, because these are all our experiences. Right? All of us kind of have had these experiences of various kinds. And I guess with age you kind of also accumulate some of those stories. What I thought I'll do, because like many of us here, I also wear multiple hats, if I may say so. I thought I would make my presentation, or at least bring up questions from two vantage points. One, from the vantage point of the fact that I was once chairperson of the GS Cash, and what it was like dealing with the question of gender on this campus. And then I'll go on to talk about what it is that I experienced as a faculty in the science. As you will notice, science was very visibly missing. So let me begin by talking about GS Cash itself and what I experienced was. Okay. As you heard from Aisha already, the function of GS Cash is actually threefold. One is supposed to be to one is to actually be, communicate the idea of gender sensitivity, to ensure that there's a lot more gender sensitive response. So there's a lot of advocacy involved. GS Cash is also supposed to do a lot of counseling and mediation of crisis. And then GS Cash is also supposed to conduct inquiries, decide punitive actions. And I just place this in perspective. Let me ask you to compare yet another such punitive body right on campus. And this is called the Proctorial Inquiry Committee. You've heard of the Proctorial Committees. No student here would be unaware of it, I'm sure. Many of you perhaps have also been on the wrong end of it, but let's compare these two. I am deliberately putting that comparison. Look at GS Cash, and you'll see that it has an extremely elaborate, extremely well thought out structure. You know, every little detail is written down. How should an inquiry be held? How should a complaint be taken down? How should, counseling be done? Who should be on the committee? Who should not be on the committee? I don't think, and prove me wrong if you can, but I don't think there's any such written record of how an inquiry should be conducted in the proctorial committee. This is not to say that the proctorial committee, therefore, is not just or fair. This is only to show you the contrast. The legitimacy that the proctorial inquiry report has, perhaps, is far more in the institutional hierarchy, in the institutional structure of even a place like JNU, than the recommendations of GS. The GS Cash inquiry reports are so detailed and so well recorded, with witnesses signing, the complainant signing, the accused signing, and so on, that it can stand up in a court of law. But what is the likelihood of those recommendations actually being taken very seriously? It really depends very much on who's going to be implementing this. And then you suddenly see, the institutional bias that happens. So even if recommendations are there, what would be the response? And you'll be quite surprised at how skewed that response is. The proctorial committee, on the other hand, can recommend rustication, all kinds of things, and it gets done. It gets done very fast. We need to start asking why the structural biases, there. Okay. Let me talk of another issue that I had. The other issue we had, and this was, of course, it was also part of our experience in the GS Cash. We were constantly debating this, discussing this, and it's something that Ujitra also pointed out, that we do have multiple identities. And many others also have pointed it out. I remember another student said this as well. What happens when you are a member of a political party and you are also in the GS Cash? Should your response be, in a certain case, true to your party line or true to your gender affiliation? Gender is not the only affiliation. There might be other affiliation. There could be a caste affiliation. It needn't be a party affiliation. There could be a community affiliation. And we do often struggle with those multiple identities. And those multiple identities do spill over into the functioning of bodies like this. And one of the issues we constantly felt, or at least I was tempted to often ask that, one of the oaths that we take should be that we'll stay away from our party affiliations as long as we are working with the organization, because this is an experience that many women have faced, not just on the JNU campus, that when there is a question of caste versus gender, or community versus gender, gender often is lost. And in a very strange way, sometimes by extremely competent women suddenly becoming very guilty of the caste they belong to, begin to get onto the wrong side of gender. Okay, I think I'll leave that open for discussion. The other issue that I thought I'd mention is that somehow on this campus, I have not got the feeling, and I've been here pretty long now, I've never had the feeling that GS Cash, Women's Studies, or in general, most progressive movements have tried to at all engage with sciences. The structure of science, because hardly anyone here needs to be told this, it is authoritarian, it is patriarchal, it is hierarchical, it is certainly very discriminatory. It is, you would have heard very many discussions on this. It's also true that people will say, well, science is all gender neutral, science is about universal truth. Again, you heard the critiques to those kinds of arguments. But the practice of science is not gender neutral. Let's not be misled by that. The practice of science is certainly very patriarchal. It's certainly very authoritarian. And often the practice of science does require a certain kind of increasingly today a large input of money, unless you are a theoretical scientist. There is really a colossal amount of money required for most sciences today, which implies dependence on funding, and that dependence on funding, of course, comes through faculty grants. And there are pressures, of course, of submitting research, the grant reports and so on. There are those pressures. I understand all of that, and I acknowledge all of that. But hidden in between all these are those patriarchal structures. What we deal with when we say, and many of us now have a lot of women students in a department like the life sciences, again, given the genre, you will find a lot more women, say, than the physics, School of Physical Sciences, or even in the computers and mathematical sciences. And they have very unique problems. Given that the structure is so male, given that the structure is so patriarchal, given that that hierarchy is not to be questioned, it is very difficult for them to even have aspirations to be anything else. The structure doesn't allow you. There is a great deal of conditioning that happens, and because many of them perhaps right after the 10th standard have nothing to do with any of these debates and discussions, they are into practicals, classrooms, they have not even been exposed to those ideas. These are bright minds. By assuming that somehow they will be reactionary, they will be, right-wing, they will necessarily be conservative, you've already lost out on a whole generation. And in JNU, it is surprising, but we seem to have done it year after year. We completely ignored that they exist. There is no talking to that happens, across disciplines, and certainly never are the sciences. I do not even know whether a program like this, for example, was advertised enough in the sciences. The assumption is they will not be interested. And some of that assumption is very much true. But will we then not make any attempts to change that? Because then we are saying we should not change patriarchy either, because patriarchy exists. Right? In society as such, if you want society to change, you're going to have to consider, and not just talk amongst ourselves. We all would agree on these things. There's no problem with that. So we are essentially talking to ourselves. It's high time we started addressing another constituency and asking what is it that we gain and they gain from that experience. I leave it here for the discussion.
Thank you very much.
Thanks everybody. Everybody who spoke, the floor is now open for discussion. We have half an hour, and I must also, this is my pleasant task every time, always sharing the last session to tell you that there's high tea outside. I heard the cups clinking, and there's also nice and sweet, so do stay. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Radhika from Mental and Media. A lot of very interesting ideas and questions have been thrown out in the three presentations we have seen. One issue which has been bothering me for some time now is that the recent events and all the recent discussions around it, we have seen an increasing tendency to separate violence from, as has been said, from any personal kind of issues about intimate violence or anything. So, in Utkar's presentation, if I'm not wrong, she highlighted, what has been repeatedly said, that rape is a political act. It is not about sexual desire. Now, but many of the comments which have been made here have highlighted the relationship between the everyday acts of violence, Mr. Hassan highlighted the Shukra cultural night, where the notion of masculinity and how jokes come about and how all these things are fun in everyday life. So my concern is that there is very little discussion amongst even our personal lives
about what is this everyday thing which legitimizes a certain kind of hegemonized notion of sexuality, where the male is superior and the female is inferior, and that itself becomes sexually, attractive. So, would this kind of a hegemony, I mean, like in today's context, the questions which the 1960s radical feminists raised, like McKenna and Andrea Dworkin, I mean, those kinds of positions have been increasingly said to be just holding very, very moralistic and very, very one-sided opinion, which may be largely true, but the essential point which they were making, which I see every day, in many of relationships, personal relationships, is that, I mean, where do we distinguish between female agency of choice and an act of violence? Because in like cases of domestic violence, let's say, for a long time, women who are experiencing it are not able to accept it as an act of violence. It is an act of love. So, and these discussions, when we talk about sexual violence, is there any way in which the legal system, as such, can initiate a discussion on it? Because these are such complex issues where we don't know, I mean, clearly how to, if we take a legal stand, we are increasing surveillance, and if we do not talk about it or do not address it, the larger structures of patriarchy are in control. And as long as that is there, punitive mechanisms outside for violence on the streets or violence in public spaces, for me, is not sufficient to address this.
Can we take 2 or 3 questions? I think Aparna has a question and maybe another one, and maybe I leave it to the panel to decide who wants to respond.
Did you want to request?
No, doesn't matter. Comment over there.
But I was just thinking aloud because when you said there was clash of solidarities and then gender keeps on using against caste. So I was thinking, why does that happen? Because on one side I know that that women face the responsibility or the extra burden of defending the Dalit man appearances. On the other side, they do feel like probably the gender use is because the solidarities lie in the caste more than the gender. Are the women more inclusive of Dalit women? As you know, are we somehow alienating the Dalit women in the process? Because when the recent event that happened with the pamphlet coming out, I knew that there were a lot of Dalit women who had problems with the way the discourse was happening, but they didn't come out and talk as much because people, I know that the pamphlet came in the right time and it was a necessary step. But when the UDSF came with another pamphlet countering the language, they said that it was not caste sensitive, the language that was used, there was then hampering to find the Dalit women who would side up with it. So does Dalit women then become an administrative category, and is that why gender keeps on losing when it is? Because there is no solidarity or unity.
Anybody else who would like to add? Yeah, Amrita and then the other two. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Amrita. I'm a PhD student at the University Center. Actually, since this conversation and this discussion is about, we are looking at sexual violence vis-a-vis and I'm here only 2 months. So and also we are discussing about GS Cash, and since it's a mandate, I come from the corporate world and most informal industry in the corporate world is that writing. And certain organizations also have taken this mandate seriously of having a sexual violence redressal cell. However, so just would like to, there's certain instances that have happened there and which have left me with a few questions which I would like to understand from Geneva
if there is parallel that you guys can draw here as well. When it comes to the impact of a verbal abuse or sexual abuse, and here I am talking about verbal abuse because this was a big significance regarding that. I've seen what has happened is there is always there's this person who got sacked from an organization because he was charged of making this comment in for the language that I use, but I'm quoting him. He asked this female principal, इस बिल्डिंग में बहुत चुगन चुगाई होती होगी ना, and the police came and reported that this was very suggestive. Why did he use this language? He could have simply asked if a lot of sex happened in this building. Now, the thing is the impact of verbal abuse also somewhere anchored in, because this person is A from Bihar, B is also, he speaks, he prefers, he is comfortable speaking in the vernacular language, which is also very, and which made the female colleague of his feel that he was being very crass. She said that he could have simply said, this agreement and a lot of sex was happening in the So, I just want to understand, does the impact of abuse also comes, somewhere, does it have this whole thing of, is there an urban base to it? If there was a person from, say, Bombay, from a different community saying it in saying it in English, would it not have the same impact on the person? And since Sneha has talked about the method of inquiry that is being laid out in the GS Cash, how do you go about inquiring a case of violence? If these kind of things have been faced, I'm just trying to give an example from an outside world and trying to understand how these things happen.
There's a question.
I'm Anna Varghese doing PhD in the Center of Historical Studies. This is also not a question, but I thought I would just share something. I've been married for the past 3.5 years, and I've been living within campus. My husband is also doing his PhD here. I've been on this campus 1 year before I got married, and the life that it threw open to me before marriage and after marriage was entirely different, I would call it. It kind of brought in a sense of identity crisis because of the responses that I got from others. Like, one thing is that in the first year of marriage I heard comments like, you are not supposed to wear black dress, it is inauspicious for your husband, why don't you wear sindoor and come out, don't you why do you walk alone? These kind of questions really make me think. And even today, minimum 4 people ask me every day, where is your husband? It's almost like you are not supposed to walk alone, you are not supposed to talk to anybody else. Recently, I was going somewhere with another friend of mine, a male friend of mine, on a bike. And right now, my husband is not here in campus, he is gone for field work. So somebody asked me, oh, your husband is not here, so you're having a good time. It is absolutely ridiculous because once you're married, you're supposed to walk only with your husband or talk only with your husband. I would like to just point out that JNU in that sense is not so different from the others. And 2 points that I wanted to make is, one is that I live in Mahanadi, there is no mess facility in Mahanadi. Just because you're married, you're expected to cook and take care of the entire household. I would draw attention to it. And second thing is, there is no proper gynecological facility in our health center. There's only a gynecologist who comes only twice in a week, that also for 2 hours. So if these 2 concerns, if we can take up to the administration level, at least the gynecologist, it would be. Thank you.
on the panel to respond to all or some or whichever of the comments and questions that have come, and then we can take another round if we have the time, and then we take it.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting. I'd like to respond to the question that Vartika you asked. And I thought that, you know, it's amazing how this movement on the streets has been able to bring together in such innovative ways myriad issues related to women's freedom, their sexual autonomy, and oppression of Dalit women and women belonging to oppressed nationalities, because obviously there is a way in which the slogan of Azadi has come together with, you know, talking about sapne bunne ki azadi, sathi chunne ki azadi, baap se azadi, khap se azadi. You know, so the use of, you know, baap and khap, and of, you know, taking your own life's decisions, and all of these in the same sentence, and with the slogan of Azadi, is, I think, extremely empowering. And I think that when we ask this question about, you know, redressal, and then at one point when we say that, you know, of course there are institutions, but what is happening at an everyday level, because I think a lot of the comments were implying the personal and the other kind of spaces. And I think that if one looks very closely at the various kinds of outpourings that the incident provoked, even though, you know, in instances of sexual violence and rape are kind of common in our country. There is Doli Pratha, wherein, you know, Dalit women have to be, you know, have to involuntarily kind of sleep with the Brahmin man. I thought that if we look at this movement very closely, we could find a lot of these answers there, and I thought that perhaps there could be another way in which this movement very innovatively addresses a range of issues related to consent, related to how one moralizes rape, related to you know, the two-finger test, and what is the rationale of talking about habituation to sex and its connection with rape, and what is the rationale of, you know, something like AFSPA and giving impunity to government officials and CRPF. So I think that there is a way in which, you know, rape and sexual violence as an instrument of social control, of state's control, of oppressed nationalities, of Dalit women, of, you know, how patriarchal control in personal spaces, in domestic spaces, the instance of marital rape, all of these issues can be brought together. I think this is a beautiful example of how it can be brought together. So I think that that point kind of is important.
Sort of not as an answer, but just thinking with Vartika in terms of sexual desire, which was sort of brought up, and looking at, yes, a lot of discussion, a lot of things that we have been speaking about that the women's movement in this country has also responded to has been around questions of sexual violence or around the question of reproduction. These are 2 points that we sort of keep revisiting in many ways. But then also questions about how is it that we don't throw the baby along with the bathwater. How can we possibly speak about sexual desire and love while also mindful of the many blinders that sort of are inbuilt in it. And I think Kapila had this nice piece I recently read, which sort of took out a piece, instance from this movie, Devli, where Paro takes her bedding and sort of walks into the field, and she's all ready and said she's there to have sex with her boyfriend. And the audience, of course, finds it hilarious because they're not sort of used to women forefronting desire and putting it out and aggressively also demanding for it, also asking for it. So this idea that women also desire, which is something which is so commonsensical that, but at the same time requires reiteration, is, I think it speaks volumes about the times that we live in, that we have to also say that women have desire. In terms of Amrita's point, about largely a question of class, would you agree? Is that, are we looking at a question of class and gender perhaps, because the guy was from Bihar and the woman was perhaps more of an urban centered. I find it extremely complicated because when I use public transport in the city, I think it becomes, many a times I feel that women who are, there is also a sort of a standard in which we dress in this city, standard ways in which we dress, we all have jeans and with that. But also at certain points, women coming from obviously a certain class find it easier to yell at the ticket conductor wala or somebody by virtue of his class. While on that front that works, also I think in certain sense, when I feel insecure in a public transport or when I'm traveling outside, I also use class to my advantage and use it as a self-defense and do not try and otherwise sort of those sort of those boundaries that I otherwise try and work through by talking to my auto rickshaw wala, etc., which I don't do when I feel that I am in certain places not feeling extremely safe. So there are extremely complicated ways in which it works out, but I think Sneha ma'am would be able to tell us more in terms of how GS Cash handles it when it comes to an inquiry. In terms of what Aparna has raised about Dalit women, and especially the case that happened on campus, again, it is extremely complicated because, yes, in all sorts of instances of violence that have happened against Dalit women, you have upper caste women standing with their husbands and brothers and fathers prodding on them to do the act, go and punish the woman who's there, and because she sort of, needs to be punished. We also had post-1 upper caste women coming out in the streets along with, in solidarity with their upper caste husbands, saying that we are worried about our upper caste husbands' jobs. So having done that, and also sort of a huge lacunae within the movement, women's movement, in historically sidelining Dalit women's issues and their experiences, has now led to a very strong Dalit women's feminist standpoint which is being articulated. We do, I think, works of Sharmila Rege, which I personally really like, in Maharashtra, in Tamil Nadu, Geeta writing about Periyar and the self-respect movement. There is a sort of an assertion which is coming out, and there are really interesting things are being thrown up, like Savariya, which Arunima had asked me to read. There were very poignant critiques about this movement also that is happening in the city, which is that time and again Dalit women get raped all the time, and the manner in which the process in which the violence is wrapped, it is so obvious, and at the same time there is no sort of movement around it. So how is it, coming back to my question of opening up spaces on this campus to speak about or starting off any kind of initiative, while we are mindful of the fact that there is no sort of easy solidarity that can be forged, how is it that we can reclaim a sort of a naive articulation, sort of reclaim a unitary category women through our assertion by saying that we as women stand against upper caste oppression, we as women stand against the kind of violence that the state has against Muslim women, or the way in Godra rights things worked out. I think that is the only way through our protest can we sort of reclaim a unitary space, a little bit minimal unitary space of it. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll continue with that before I tell about the GS Cash inquiry itself. This issue of caste, class, or caste, gender becoming quite significant. I think there are at least, I'm sure there are wiser people here who can perhaps discuss this more threadbare than I can. But I think there are at least two issues here. One is the issue that for most of our lives, we as women, as daughters, as whatever, we are taught to put ourselves at the last. The family comes first, the community comes first, the whatever else comes first, and that gets internalized to a point where your gender is not first. Your gender is always last. That's something that we imbibe very clearly. The other issue, I think, which makes it so difficult, I mean, it is not so simple really. What is your association? Should it be with the caste or with the
with the gender. Women are very divided on caste, class, whatever lines, and our experiences on those things are pretty different. Dalit women, for example, I remember this particular incident in Hyderabad when I was a student. It was some people here will know it was in EPW all over, there was a lot of discussion about it. This was a particular peculiar case where this woman, she was, well, she was not really upper caste, but she was certainly, you know, she was perhaps OBC, but the guy was Dalit. And the guy decided to pursue her. He was more or less a stalker. And she protested very strongly. She did not want him to be putting up poetry, you know, poems on her on the walls, sending notes to her hostel room. There were all kinds of, and then it kept getting more and more violent, the language, because she would refuse. And I remember at that time, the women's movement and the University of Hyderabad actually had a pretty strong women's movement. There were several people who felt very uncomfortable with the fact that the woman refused. They felt that given that he was Dalit, whatever, this was a class position that she was taking. That this was this upper, I mean, you know, this thing that she was upper caste, that she was more privileged, she had no right to refuse. And there was a huge debate on it. It brought out lots of very interesting things because Dalit women then got together and said, you women don't understand, you are upper caste, you make, you know, you speak this language, you dress in this way, you don't understand, we experience everyday violence even from within our community. And in our community, we can't speak about the Dalit women's position, it's always the Dalit man's position. The Dalit woman comes in the picture when she is raped or when something like that happens, but otherwise her rights don't matter. Within the community we can't. So there was a very interesting discussion that happened at that time in relation to this. But I think this is something we have to constantly, work with. It's something that we have to try and address. What is it that, our experiences really are very different. It is very difficult to explain to somebody coming from a completely small town, experience, coming into the big city, trying to explain to them that you have all these kinds of freedoms. It's a mindset that you have to really work on changing. It doesn't happen just like that. You can't expect her to suddenly forget that her loyalties are, out with her gender and all. That's not possible. I think it's something we have to work on, and it's something that, it's a great deal of sensitization that we have to do. We assume that it's only men who need that kind of, or at least we always put it in this binary kind of a thing, but I think there's a lot more work that we need to do in addressing this issue. I remember when this question of clash of identities also came up. I remember from GS Cash, we wrote this letter to the university. This was just after the new team had been elected. We wrote to the university that, look, if you write Dr. Mrs. So-and-so, then please ensure that you write Dr. Mr. So-and-so. And they were kind of course, taken aback, but it was very interesting because this clerk called me up and said, Madam, aapne to ye keh diya, but हम Mrs. नहीं लिखेंगे तो क्या लिखेंगे? It was unthinkable that you don't write something. And then I said,
easily call everybody Mrs. Students do that all the time.
That's because we taught that. No, but you can't have an official communication.
I agree. But I'm saying that it's just endemic.
Yes. And then if I know colleagues, I have tried to tell them, you realize that I'm married to somebody who doesn't have my name? Yes. I can't be Mrs. Komal. It doesn't strike them that Mrs. Komal refers to the fact that I'm probably married to somebody who's Komal. This is my name. But then they immediately ask, but why did you change the name? No, so when I wrote this letter and this issue came up, they said, okay, we understand. Whoever has doctor, we will not write Mrs. But now those who don't have. And it was a genuine question on his part, and he thought he tried. For the man we can write Mr., but what will we write for the woman then? We have to write Mrs. So not married. Then that means we should write this. So finally I said, why don't you just use MS? That's what everyone does. The rest of the world moved on. But somehow, and believe me, in these little ways, we have never tried working on mentalities in this. When we had workshops with, say, the library staff, I was so shocked at the level of gender sensitivity. It is quite amazing that we keep saying that we in JNU are so different. We are not. We pretty much, we have our little spaces and we talk to ourselves and feel very happy, and there's a sense of collective catharsis maybe, but nothing more. We really need to work at changing the discourse on campus. Regarding how GS-Cash functions, GS-Cash, the inquiry committee itself, suppose there is a complaint by a student against a faculty or an employee versus another employee. We ensure that one of the members, at least in the committee, will be from that constituency. So, and if the issue is of, say, a Dalit, this one, and they feel that there is no representation of the Dalit, we actually co-opt someone into that committee. And both are allowed to send observers, so both the accused and the one complainant is allowed to send observers so that they know that the entire thing is fair. We record, and we've learned, at least with experience, that if you do multiple recordings, often if you have created a story, you would have realized that if you are into storytelling, I have little kids, so I do a lot of storytelling. And I can never get the same story right in the same details. And my kids are constantly complaining that was not the story, because I forget the details. If you were to multiply record, you'll figure out very soon what is the truth. What is the storyline actually? What were the embellishments in the story? And once you figure that out, you more or less know where it's going. So, but what it requires, I think, is a lot of patience and an open mind. The moment you begin with a bias, already everything is over. So, and that way, because the committee has several members, it's very useful, because even if some of us tend to go along that line or tend to succumb to pressure, there are always others to pull you back and say, no, you're going, this is your party affiliation talking, or this is your other biases talking. So that helps. Sure, there's going to be an issue of class in this particular case, but intention is something that you can still figure out. Is this an issue of language, or is this an issue of intention? And often the doublespeak is intentional. It is, it's used as a doublespeak. It's used to send in a subtle message along with what seems like a harmless statement made in whatever. So, and I think even if people come from rural backgrounds or whatever backgrounds, in these things we are socially very smart. We know what language to use. If the same person was in a setting where, let's say, his sister was getting married, we would choose his words very carefully. We cannot annoy the sisters-in-laws. It's not that they do not know. I think one needs to figure out the intention, and that can be done. If you set up a broad enough committee with both sides represented, I'm sure this can be addressed.
Any last questions? There are two. Okay, after those two, would Pratiksha and Kumkum want to say something? You do. Alright, can you quickly keep the questions as questions? Can we just have this one first and then you next? Please keep it short.
Yeah. My name is Vanessa. I'm a PhD student at the Center for Historical Studies. I think I really enjoyed the discussion today. There were a lot of interesting things said, a lot of things that one would like to respond to, but one thing particularly that Abhijit said, it touched a nerve with me. She spoke in a presentation about self-censoring that women activists do in terms of dress, in terms of sexuality. And I think that's a really, really important question. And I would like to add to that a question that I have been struggling with, because I've been active in the students' movement in campus, and I've tried to be active in mass politics on campus as well. And I think, I mean, not that I'm saying Raghunachi per se did this, but like often when one looks at women activists and the choices that they make, especially women activists on the left, and the choices that they make in terms of dress, in terms of how open they are about their sexuality, talking about it, exercising it, I think sometimes it's easy to slip into this easy mode of critique. Whereas the more difficult question, I think, lies in how is it that one goes about fearlessly exercising one's sexuality and making choices about one's body and personal appearance, while also trying to engage seriously in a mass politics in a patriarchal society. And I am somebody who had extremely short hair for at least 6 or 7 years. Now, as you can see, my hair is not extremely short. And that is a choice that I am basically judged for. But that's a choice that I made because in a lot of the campaigns that I've been a part of, I just simply got sick of people saying, is that a boy or a girl? I did that back, what are you looking? And I found that too often in these campaigns or protests or meetings that we had, I found that the length of my hair became a far more central question than what it is that I was trying to say about the right of women to have whatever length of hair that they choose. So I think this is an extremely complex negotiation that one has to deal with sort of. I'm not saying that one can't ask a question, but one has to also be able to empathize with the fact that these are not easy questions. Like for instance, I got married last month, and everybody that I know says, "Are you so happy nishani nahi hai, so happy nishani nahi hai." And the women that say these things to me are also women who are part of organizations that I'm working in. So it's not something that can be dismissed entirely. And just to say one more thing, which is, I think it's important that Avitra spoke about trying to reclaim the unitary category of women and trying to bring the solidarity across classes and castes. And I think there is some merit in that. I think there's a lot to be said for efforts of that kind. But if I am to expect a woman from another class or caste to think of me as somebody that she can have a certain solidarity with, I have to give her a very compelling reason for her to think that. And there's just one brief thing that I shared. We were once on this campaign, and this was a Gujjar woman, this is the agro-pastoralist child, and she shook hands with me and she said, "Didi, aapke haath kitne woman hai?" And she touched my hair and she said, "I was a bit of shampoo, but why is my hair not as soft as yours?" And that is a question that haunts me. And if I am to expect that she will think of me as somebody who is a comrade or a sister, then I have to give a really compelling reason so she can think beyond how soft my hands are or how soft my hair is. And so solidarity is something that, this is what has been said, I'm just reiterating, the solidarity is something that one has to really work hard to build. It's not something that one can just assume exists.
Can we have the comment or whatever at the back, please, quickly, and keep it short, please? We're really running short of time. I'm so sorry about it.
I really welcome especially the kind of inputs that come from Avitra and Avinashi, because as a left activist myself in this campus, there are a lot of times we don't put ourselves into an introspective mode. We usually react to certain instances when they happen, and it's important for us to look at the kind of interventions we make when gender issues are concerned. Is our intervention only reactive, or it also is able to enable some space? And also, what Vanessa just said, as we have also to come to that, is when we talk about women activists, as an activist, right from my home, I've had certain hormonal problems. So, used to my family not being able to look past my face, look past the facial hair or the acne or the weight problems. And it is in this campus that one actually finds it liberating that people don't see it more of an hurry. So that compelling means that I do not have to look good. I do not have to be aesthetically appealing for people to take notice of me. It's also liberating in its own way. So that's just another alternative way of seeing things. We were a group on this. I wish there were more activists here, so we could have really introspected our own role in various movements and in campus in general.
Very quickly, I think this second session has been really it's opened up many issues that I think needed to be opened up, and I would like to thank all of those who spoke for that. I just wanted to very briefly touch on the experience of being on DSCash almost 10 years ago. And what I wanted to share, and this is because it's so long ago in some ways, is that for every case that came up, there would always be some space from which the accused would be protected. It's not only caste. In some cases it would be the community, it could be the majority community, it could be the minority community. In some cases it could be the region, in some cases it could be political affiliations. In one case it was that he's a very good student. So I'm just putting this for you because it's something that I think was coming from what Sneha was saying. So it's just something that we need to really think about, that why is it the moment a woman makes a complaint, there's some space from which there's a counter-attack that is launched on her. And it's not only caste, and I think we need to look at that complexity as well. And why that happens, because while I agree that what Ujitra is suggesting is an ideal world of solidarity, and I don't see it happening easily as many of you have pointed out, I think we also need to see what's happening there. Why is it that the moment a woman complains, there's something or the other there's some vantage point from which that complaint is, the legitimacy of that complaint is kind of questioned. And the point that Aisha was making also, and which, even in the cases where we not only got recommendations, but we got recommendations that were implemented, even in those cases, the women who, in one sense, won their battles, they led the university. And I think that's something we really need to think about. Where is it that this redressal is leading us, and what are the ways in which we can think about it more creatively?
Given the paucity of time, if Abhijit and Ujitra want to respond to the comments that have come, may I give you just 5 minutes or 2 minutes? Okay, you don't want to. Within 5 minutes, please.
Yeah, I welcome both your responses, Vanessa and Shivani, and I acknowledge the complexity of the issue involved here. But what I wanted to bring to fore was just that there is a way in which, the two almost contrary modes of being, and also because, we would like to see that personal space is also making political statements. We sometimes almost kind of overlook and see these as unproblematized and accepted. So the effort therefore was only to throw them up for further problematization, and therefore, I think I'm really glad that it struck a chord with you people. So
thank you very much. TOE. Thank you, really, everybody. Thank you.
Now is all that happens.